The morning of April 15th, 1943, broke cold and brittle over occupied Belgium. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin enough to turn breath into knives and freeze gun oil into sludge. Below, the patchwork fields of Flanders spread like a quilt stitched with hedgerows and bomb craters. Above, contrails stretched white across a sky that had become the most dangerous place on Earth. Captain Werner Schroer of Jagdgeschwader 26 adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon with the casual confidence of a man who had done this 200 times before. His Focke-Wulf 190 hummed beneath him, a magnificent machine, all muscle and menace. Beside him flew men who had cut their teeth over Britain, men who knew the weight of a trigger and the mathematics of deflection shooting. They were the predators of this sky, and they knew it. Then, through the haze of high-altitude sun, Schroer saw something that made him blink twice. American fighters, yes, but not the nimble Spitfires or the twin-boomed Lightnings. These were different, huge, ungainly. Their fuselages looked swollen, their wings stubby and thick. He keyed his radio, and his voice carried equal parts amusement and disbelief. "The Americans are flying barrels." Laughter crackled across the channel. Other pilots confirmed the sighting. The shapes approaching from the west looked absurd, like someone had strapped wings to a milk jug and hoped for the best. How could something that heavy, that clumsy-looking, possibly survive in a sky ruled by the sleek killers of the Luftwaffe? The Germans had every reason to be confident. For nearly 4 years, they had dominated European airspace with machines that seemed purpose-built for murder. The Messerschmitt 109, with its needle nose and vicious climb rate, could reach 30,000 feet faster than anything the Allies had fielded. The Focke-Wulf 190, powered by a snarling radial engine, tore through bomber formations, like a chainsaw through timber. And the men flying them were no mere pilots. They were aces, veterans who had learned their craft over Spain, Poland, France, and the burning skies of Britain. Names like Günther Rahl, Adolf Galland, and Egon Meyer carried weight in both Berlin and London. These were men who thought in 3 dimensions, who could calculate a deflection shot while pulling 4 Gs in a climbing spiral. They had sent hundreds of Allied planes tumbling earthward in flames, and they would send hundreds more. The Americans knew this better than anyone. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By the spring of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces was bleeding. The promise of daylight precision bombing, the grand strategy that said brave crews could cripple Germany's war machine by hitting factories and rail yards with surgical accuracy, was unraveling mission by mission. Bombers flew in tight formations, silver fortresses bristling with guns, their contrails marking them like targets painted on the sky. They climbed into the stratosphere, where the cold could freeze a man's blood in his veins, and pushed eastward toward the heart of Hitler's Reich. And they died in staggering numbers. A single raid over Bremen in October would cost 60 bombers and 600 men. Over Schweinfurt, the losses were even worse. Air crews whispered bitter jokes about flak so thick you could walk on it, about the black blossoms of anti-aircraft fire that turned daylight into a storm of shrapnel. But it wasn't the flak that haunted them most. It was the fighters. The sudden streaking shapes diving from the sun, spitting cannon fire, then climbing away untouched while B-17s fell, spiraling, burning, breaking apart. Men bailed out into freezing air 30,000 feet above enemy territory, and many never made it down alive. The problem was brutally simple. American fighters couldn't fly deep enough into Germany. The early P-38s had range, but were outclassed by German pilots who knew every trick. The Spitfires, the British loaned, were magnificent dogfighters, but couldn't escort bombers past the Dutch coast. The bombers needed a shield, something that could punch deep into enemy territory, survive the gauntlet of German guns, and still have enough teeth to make the Luftwaffe think twice. Back in the United States, far from the terror and cold of Europe's skies, engineers at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, thought they had an answer. What they built was not elegant. It was not graceful. But it might just save lives. They called it the P-47 Thunderbolt. When the first Thunderbolts arrived in England in January 1943, American pilots were underwhelmed. The aircraft looked like a joke. Its fuselage was barrel-chested, thick and ungainly. Its wings were wide and blunt, lacking the razor-edged beauty of a Spitfire or the menacing lines of a Messerschmitt. Up front sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an enormous 18-cylinder radial engine that gave the whole aircraft a profile like a flying bathtub. Someone called it a jug, short for juggernaut, and the nickname stuck. Even the pilots assigned to fly it struggled to hide their disappointment. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, fresh-faced and eager, remembered touching the cold aluminum skin of his assigned Thunderbolt for the first time and thinking it belonged in a barn, not a dogfight. He wasn't alone. Pilots who had flown the nimble Spitfire with Royal Air Force squadrons missed the light touch, the responsive controls, the feeling of flying something that could turn on a dime. The jug felt heavy, sluggish, like wrestling a truck through the sky. Its climb rate was abysmal. It took nearly 12 minutes to reach 30,000 feet, 3 minutes longer than a Spitfire, and painfully slower than the Messerschmitts waiting above. Across the English Channel, German intelligence officers reviewed reports on the new American fighter and scoffed. The P-47 was heavier than anything else in the sky, over 10 tons when fully loaded, far larger than the lithe predatory machines that had ruled since 1939. Luftwaffe pilots joked over mess hall tables. "A flying beer barrel," one ace chuckled. "If you shoot at it and miss, it will probably crash from embarrassment." They had faced the early American P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks with confidence. The jug didn't scare them either, at least not yet. But beneath that pudgy, ridiculous silhouette hid something different. The P-47 was not built to win beauty contests. It was built to come home. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born designer, had fled the Bolsheviks and brought with him a philosophy forged in survival. He told his engineers, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The R2800 engine could absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters. A single hit to a Messerschmitt's liquid-cooled engine meant death, glycol spraying, temperatures spiking, the pilot gliding down or bailing out. But the jug's air-cooled radial could take bullets through multiple cylinders and keep running, coughing, sputtering, but alive. Armor plating wrapped the cockpit like a knight's shield, thicker than anything the Germans or British used. The pilot sat in a steel bathtub, protected from below and behind. The massive airframe, built with doubled wing ribs to handle enormous loads, could soak up cannon shells that would shred lighter fighters. And then there were the guns. 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns sat in the wings, 4 per side, in a staggered arrangement that allowed for smooth ammunition feeding from separate holds. Each gun could fire up to 850 rounds per minute. Together, all 8 guns could throw 9 pounds of lead per second. The ammunition belts were loaded with a mix of ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds, burning at 3,000 degrees, could punch through nearly an inch of face-hardened steel at 200 yards and ignite fuel tanks on contact. A 5-second burst from all 8 guns would put 500 rounds into a 3-foot by 3-foot target area, 1,100 feet in front of the aircraft. It was a storm of metal that nothing in the sky could survive. Spent casings and steel links ejected from rectangular ports on the bottom of the wings, falling away like brass rain. But to the young men meeting the Thunderbolt for the first time, boys barely 20 years old, shipped across the Atlantic to muddy airfields in the English countryside, the promise of firepower felt distant. The jug looked slow, it felt heavy, and the Luftwaffe, veterans all, owned the sky when it mattered most. Still, war has a way of humbling certainty. The first Thunderbolts began flying combat missions in the spring of 1943. Their debut was far from glorious. Engines overheated, radio problems plagued formations. Pilots struggled to keep pace with German aces who knew every maneuver in the book. On one early escort mission, a young pilot described watching a formation of B-17s shredded while his squadron fumbled to maintain position. "We were supposed to be their angels," he wrote home, "but we felt like ghosts." April 15th, 1943, changed everything. The P-47s of the 335th Squadron met German fighters over Belgium for the first time in actual combat. The engagement was brief, brutal, and confusing. 3 German fighters went down. 3 P-47s were lost. It was a draw on paper, but something had shifted. The Germans, expecting easy kills, found themselves trading blows with an opponent that refused to break. Pilots who had emptied their cannons into a Thunderbolt returned furious, claiming the Americans flew on as if nothing happened. Gun camera footage showed P-47s shaking under impact, smoke trailing, pieces flying off, yet still clawing for home. One veteran swore he had seen a jug with its canopy blown off and half its tail shredded, still flying level. It was unsettling. And then there was the speed. The Thunderbolt couldn't outturn a German fighter at low altitude. It couldn't outclimb them from the deck. But it could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe had. In a world where altitude meant survival, where gravity became a weapon, the P-47's sheer weight turned into an unexpected advantage. If a fight went bad, a jug pilot could roll over, point the nose down, and drop like a stone, accelerating past 500 miles per hour, faster than a Messerschmitt dared to follow. German pilots who tried to pursue found their aircraft shaking, controls stiffening, the airframe protesting under the strain. The jug just kept diving, pulling away, escaping into the safety of speed and mass. Slowly, quietly, the Thunderbolt began to earn respect. Men climbed out of aircraft riddled with holes, sometimes missing large chunks of wing or tail, eyes wide with disbelief. "If this had been a Spit," one pilot muttered after landing with oil spraying from a shot-out engine, "I'd be dead." Word spread through the squadrons. The jug could take it. It could bring you home. Meanwhile, in briefing rooms back in Germany, Luftwaffe officers began noticing troubling patterns. Pilots who had been untouchable since 1940 were returning with damage, limping back to base, their confidence shaken. The Americans were learning. They were adapting. And the jug, once mocked, was proving to be a brawler that hit back, hard. The real transformation began not in the air, but on the ground, in the mud and cold of English airfields where men like Colonel Hubert, Zemke were rewriting the rules of fighter combat. Zemke was sharp, pragmatic, and restless, a man who had served as a combat observer with the Royal Air Force in 1940 and understood what the Luftwaffe could do. He commanded the 56th Fighter Group, soon to be known as Zemke's Wolfpack, and he knew the Thunderbolt's weaknesses as well as its strengths. The jug couldn't dogfight at low altitude. It couldn't turn with a Messerschmitt or a Fokker-Wulf. Fine, then they wouldn't fight that way. Zemke gathered his pilots in cramped briefing rooms and hammered home a new doctrine. "Don't turn with them," he barked, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "Dive, shoot, climb, and dive again. Use your speed, use your weight. Use those 8 guns." It was the beginning of boom and zoom tactics, a style of combat that played to the Thunderbolt's brutal strengths. Climb high, use the turbo supercharger to reach altitudes where the jug's engine breathed easier than anything the Germans had. Wait. Watch. Then roll over and dive, accelerating to speeds that made the wings shake and the cockpit roar, and unleash those 850 caliber machine guns in short, devastating bursts. If the enemy survived, climb back up using the energy from the dive. Never get slow. Never get trapped in a turning fight. Hit hard, hit fast, and vanish back into the sky. The 56th Fighter Group began putting Zemke's tactics into practice, and the results were immediate. On bomber escort missions during October 1943, they shot down 29 German planes. The Luftwaffe, which had grown accustomed to picking off unescorted bombers with impunity, suddenly found itself on the defensive. They began withdrawing squadrons from coastal areas, clustering them around likely bombing targets deep in Germany, waiting for the moment when the American fighters would have to turn back due to fuel limits. But the Americans kept pushing. By late 1943, external drop tanks extended the Thunderbolt's range, allowing it to penetrate deeper into enemy territory. The Luftwaffe's safe zones were shrinking. German pilots who had spent years honing their craft, men with dozens of kills painted on their cockpits, began to feel something they hadn't felt since the early days over Britain. Fear, not the sharp fear of a single dangerous mission, but the grinding, existential fear that came from facing an opponent with limitless resources and no intention of stopping. Lieutenant Robert Johnson embodied this transformation. The nervous boy who had once doubted his ungainly jug became one of the war's most effective killers. On June 26, 1943, Johnson's Thunderbolt was shot up by Luftwaffe ace Egon Meyer during an escort mission over Villa Coublay. 21 20mm cannon shells and more than 200 machine gun bullets tore into his aircraft. The canopy shattered. The rudder was shot away. Fuel streamed from ruptured tanks. Oil covered the windscreen. Johnson, bleeding and half-blind, somehow kept the jug flying. Meyer, flying a Focke-Wulf 190A5, closed in for the kill. He pulled alongside, close enough that Johnson could see his face, and gestured for the American to bail out. Johnson, either too stubborn or too terrified to move, stayed in the cockpit. Meyer fired again. More hits. The jug shuddered but refused to die. Eventually, Meyer, either out of ammunition or out of patience, peeled away. Johnson nursed the dying Thunderbolt back across the English Channel, landing at his base with an aircraft so damaged that mechanics stood in stunned silence. They counted the holes. They measured the missing pieces. They couldn't believe he was alive. Johnson climbed out, legs shaking, and said quietly, "She brought me home." That battered P-47 became a legend. Photos of the damage circulated through squadrons. Pilots touched the torn metal like a talisman. If Johnson's jug could survive that and still fly, then maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The psychological shift was profound. Pilots who had climbed into their cockpits with white-knuckled fear now felt something else. Not confidence, exactly, but trust. Trust in the armor, trust in the engine, trust in those 8 guns. Robert Johnson would go on to score 27 aerial victories, all in the Thunderbolt, making him one of the top aces in the European theatre. He never flew another type of aircraft in combat. Years later, he would say simply, "The jug saved my life more times than I can count." For the Luftwaffe, the autumn of 1943 marked the beginning of the end. October 2nd, Zemke himself became an ace with his 5th kill. His Wolfpack was finding its rhythm, developing tactics that other groups would soon adopt. But the Germans were not done. On October 14th, the 8th Air Force launched the second raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, a mission that would go down as one of the bloodiest days of the air war. The target was deep in Germany, and the Luftwaffe knew it was coming. They waited until the P-47s, their fuel gauges dropping into the red, had to turn back. Then they attacked in force. 60 B-17s were shot down. 600 men died or were captured. The Luftwaffe lost only 13 fighters. It was a massacre, a brutal reminder that despite the Thunderbolt's growing success, the Germans still held significant cards. The raid sobered Zemke and his men. It made them realize the Luftwaffe was far from beaten, and it drove home the limitations of the jug's range, but it also hardened their resolve. 5 days later, on November 5th, a grim 56th Fighter Group took off on another bomber escort mission to Munster. This time, they were one of 8 fighter groups providing near-continuous protection. The tactics were evolving. The Thunderbolts climbed to 30,000 feet and waited. When German fighters appeared, the jugs dove. The engagement was chaos, a swirling melee of screaming engines and tracer fire. But this time, the Americans held the advantage. The high-altitude turbo supercharger, the system that gave the P-47 its altitude performance, was proving its worth. At 30,000 feet, the jug's engine produced power that German fighters couldn't match. The massive turbocharger, spinning at 21,300 revolutions per minute, forced air into the engine with such pressure that the exhaust pipes glowed red-hot. Pilots learned to recognize the sound, a distinctive whine that became the Jug's signature. German pilots began to dread it. The arrival of new technology accelerated the Thunderbolt's dominance. In early 1944, Curtiss paddle blade propellers replaced the earlier designs, increasing climb rate at lower altitudes by 40%. German pilots who had relied on steep climbs to evade the Jug suddenly found themselves caught. The water injection war emergency power system gave an additional burst of 800 horsepower when needed, enough to close the gap on even the fastest German fighters. And the guns, those 850 caliber Browning M2s, became the stuff of nightmares. Captain Francis Gabreski, another Wolfpack ace who would finish the war with 28 kills, all in P-47s, said that when the Jug's guns hit a target, the enemy didn't just fall, they disintegrated. A 2-second burst at 300 yards created a wall of lead that no aircraft could penetrate. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each weighing over 700 grains and travelling at nearly 2,900 feet per second, tore through aluminum fuselages like paper. They punched through engine blocks, severed control cables, and ignited fuel tanks with white-hot intensity. German pilots who had grown accustomed to the lighter armament of Spitfires and Hurricanes found themselves facing something entirely different. The Jug didn't hurt. It was obliterated. One German pilot, interviewed after the war, described watching a P-47's tracer fire converge on a Messerschmitt 109 ahead of him. The entire fighter simply came apart in mid-air, he said. One moment it was there, the next it was debris. There was no parachute. There was no time. Among the Germans who learned to fear the Thunderbolt was Hans Philipp, a highly decorated ace with over 200 missions to his credit. On October 8, 1943, Philipp's Messerschmitt 109 suffered engine failure at high altitude during an engagement with P-47s. The Thunderbolts, in their element, dove on his formation. Johnson's combat report was brief and clinical. Saw hits along the body, the aircraft exploded, no parachute. The psychological effect was immense. If Philipp, a man who had survived 200 missions and countless dogfights, couldn't escape the Jug's fury, what hope did average German pilots have? The answer was becoming increasingly clear: not much. By the winter of 1943 to 1944, the balance of power in the European skies was shifting irrevocably. The Thunderbolt groups were racking up kills at a rate that shocked both sides. The 56th Fighter Group alone would claim nearly 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed by the end of the war, more than any other fighter unit in the 8th Air Force. The Jug's reputation spread. Bomber crews, who spent their missions in constant terror of German fighters, began to breathe easier when they saw the distinctive silhouette of Thunderbolts above them. Those wide wings, that barrel-chested fuselage, the sound of 850 caliber guns roaring defiance, all became symbols of protection. Pilots developed an almost spiritual bond with their aircraft. They painted names on the nose, personalized the cockpits, talked to their Jugs like they were living things, and in a way, they were. The Thunderbolt didn't just carry men into combat. It carried their hopes, their fears, their desperate need to survive one more mission. It became a partner, a guardian, a friend who never let them down. The German response to the Thunderbolt's dominance was telling. Luftwaffe commanders, who had initially dismissed the aircraft as too heavy and slow, began issuing warnings to their pilots. Avoid engaging P-47s at high altitude. Don't chase them in a dive. If you damage one, assume it's still dangerous. The mockery had stopped. The laughter had died. Now there was only grim respect and a growing sense that the war in the air was slipping away. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 and early 1944 would eventually take over the long-range escort role, flying deeper into Germany than the Thunderbolt could manage. But the Jug had done its job. It had held the line during the darkest months. It had taught a generation of American pilots how to hunt. It had broken the Luftwaffe's confidence and proven that the Americans could not only survive but dominate. And it was about to take on a new role, one that would make it even more feared: the role of a killer on the ground. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the spring of 1944, the European air war had entered a new phase. The Allied invasion of Normandy was approaching, and the need for air superiority extended beyond protecting bombers. The ground forces needed close air support, something that could strike German armor, supply lines, and troop concentrations with devastating effect. The Thunderbolt, with its rugged construction and heavy firepower, was perfect for the job. As the P-51 Mustang took over more of the high-altitude escort missions, the Jug transitioned to fighter-bomber operations. Loaded with bombs and rockets in addition to its 8 machine guns, it became a ground attack aircraft without peer. The same characteristics that made it a survivor in air-to-air combat, the tough airframe, the resilient engine, the heavy armor, made it ideal for low-level strafing and bombing runs where anti-aircraft fire was intense. Pilots adapted quickly. They learned to dive on targets at speeds that made the airframe groan, release their bombs or rockets with brutal precision, and then strafe with their 50 caliber guns before climbing away. The Jug could absorb ground fire that would tear lighter fighters apart. Flak that would down a Spitfire or a Mustang often just punched holes in the Thunderbolt's thick wings and fuselage, wounds that the aircraft wore like battle scars. German soldiers on the ground began to dread the sound of the P-47's engine. That distinctive roar, the howl of the turbocharger, the sudden hammering of 8 machine guns, all became harbingers of death. Convoys scattered, tanks sought cover, soldiers dove into ditches. But there was often nowhere to hide. The Thunderbolt's firepower was overwhelming. Pilots discovered that the 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate the thin rear armor of German tanks, particularly the engine deck gratings. A technique called skip firing emerged, where pilots would approach tanks from behind at low altitude and spray rounds under the chassis, igniting fuel tanks and ammunition stores. It was dangerous work, requiring nerves of steel and split-second timing, but the results were devastating. From D-Day on June 6, 1944, until VE Day on May 8, 1945, Thunderbolt pilots claimed destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The numbers were staggering, a testament to the Jug's effectiveness in the ground attack role, but they came at a cost. Ground attack was inherently more dangerous than air-to-air combat. Anti-aircraft guns were everywhere, hidden in hedgerows, positioned on rooftops, mounted on half-tracks. Pilots flew low and slow, making themselves vulnerable to even small-caliber fire. Several high-scoring aces were lost to flak during ground attack missions. On July 20, 1944, Francis Gabreski, the top-scoring ace in Europe with 28 kills, was shot down while strafing an airfield. His propeller struck the ground during a low pass, and he bellied the aircraft in, becoming a prisoner of war. It was a sobering reminder that even the best pilots were not invincible, and even the toughest aircraft had limits. Still, the Thunderbolt's impact on the ground war was undeniable. During Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, P-47s played a crucial role. On July 29, near Runtsey, the 405th Fighter Group attacked a German column trapped between American armored divisions. They hit the column repeatedly from 3:10 in the afternoon until 9:40 in the evening. Ground investigations afterward found 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 guns destroyed. It was carnage on a scale that changed the nature of warfare. The combination of air power and ground mobility was creating a new reality, one where German forces could not move during daylight without risking annihilation. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The great aces were dead, captured, or too exhausted to continue. New pilots arrived with barely a few hours of training and faced swarms of experienced American hunters. Fuel shortages kept many aircraft grounded. Airfields were cratered and strafed. The once mighty German Air Force was being hollowed out, one mission at a time, by an enemy that refused to stop coming. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 marked the Luftwaffe's last gasp. On January 1, 1945, nearly 1,000 German fighters and bombers launched a surprise strike against Allied airfields, hoping to catch the Americans and British on the ground. More than 200 Allied aircraft were destroyed, including numerous P-47s. It was a tactical success, but it cost the Luftwaffe pilots and planes it could not replace. The losses were catastrophic, and after that desperate gamble, the German Air Force effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. The Thunderbolts continued their work through the final months of the war. They flew low over burning cities, shattered factories, and retreating columns. They encountered less and less resistance. The skies that had once been contested with savage intensity were now empty, save for the victors. Pilots looked down at the devastation below and felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The war was ending, but the cost had been immense. Robert Johnson's war ended before the final surrender. By then, he was one of America's top-scoring aces in Europe, with 27 confirmed kills, all achieved in the Thunderbolt. He had survived when so many others had not, and the weight of that survival sat heavy on him. On his last mission, he looked down from his battered cockpit at a Germany that was burning and broken. Rail yards twisted into scrap, roads clogged with retreating armour, airfields abandoned, their runways pockmarked with craters. He thought of friends, lost, names and faces that would never grow old. He thought of the first day he had fired those 8 guns in terror, not knowing if he would live to see the sunset, and he thought of how far both he and his jug had come. "We were supposed to be shields," he later wrote in his memoir, "but somewhere along the way, we became swords." Colonel Hubert Zemke survived the war as well, though not without hardship. In October 1944, he was forced down over Germany and spent the final months of the war as a prisoner. But his legacy was secure. Zemke's Wolfpack, the 56th Fighter Group, remained one of the most successful fighter units in history. The tactics he forged from necessity, the doctrine of speed and firepower over maneuverability, would echo through air combat strategy for generations. The lessons learned in the cockpit of the P-47, use your strengths, avoid your weaknesses, hit hard and vanish, became foundational principles. For the Luftwaffe, the lesson was bitter and final. Overconfidence had met industrial might, adaptation, and stubborn resolve. Mockery had turned to fear, but the realization came too late. The Reich's air arm, once the terror of Europe, died not in a single climactic battle, but in 1,000 relentless cuts delivered by planes its pilots had scorned. Men like Heinz Baer, one of the few German aces to survive the entire war, would later say that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. It was an understatement born of hard experience. The Thunderbolt didn't just win fights. It changed the rules of engagement. It forced the Luftwaffe to adapt. And when the Germans couldn't adapt fast enough, it destroyed them. In the final days of the war, as American pilots flew low over surrendered airfields and columns of prisoners, there was no gloating. There was only quiet relief and a deep understanding of what it had cost. The Jug's victory was built on courage, blood, and persistence, not glamour. It was a workhorse's triumph, the victory of the stubborn and the tough over the sleek and the skilled. History would remember the P-51 Mustang as the elegant war winner, the fighter that escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back. And it deserved that recognition. But among those who flew, among the men who climbed into a cockpit every morning not knowing if they would see the next dawn, the Thunderbolt remained something else, entirely. It was the underestimated brute that turned fear into fighting spirit. It was the machine that brought them home when everything else said they should be dead. More than 15,600 Thunderbolts were built between 1941 and 1945, more than any other American fighter. They served in every theatre of the war except Alaska. They flew more than 746,000 sorties. They claimed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and tens of thousands of vehicles, trains, and tanks on the ground. The kill-to-loss ratio in air combat was 4.6 to 1 in favor of the Thunderbolt, a testament to both the aircraft's capabilities and the skill of the men who flew it. But statistics alone cannot capture what the Jug gave to its pilots. It gave Green Boys a fighting chance against men who had mastered the sky. It gave fragile bomber crews the hope of seeing another dawn. And it gave the Allies time, precious time to learn, adapt, and ultimately overwhelm an enemy that once seemed invincible. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, was the only 8th Air Force unit that continued flying the P-47 by choice through the end of the war, even when P-51 Mustangs were available. They preferred the Jug, trusted it, knew its quirks and strengths. By the time the guns fell silent in May 1945, they had claimed 677.5 air victories and 311 ground kills, at the cost of 128 aircraft. It was a record unmatched by any other fighter group. After the war, many Thunderbolts were scrapped, cut up for aluminum, their purpose fulfilled. But a few survived, preserved in museums or restored by collectors who understood their significance. Robert Johnson would later stand beside a restored Jug in peacetime, running a hand along its thick fuselage, feeling the rivets and the cold metal. "They laughed at, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "But she brought us home." Behind him, the big radial engine was silent, but those who had heard it roar could still feel its presence. That deep, powerful sound, the whine of the turbocharger, the hammering of 8 50-caliber machine guns, the noise of survival. The war had begun with the Luftwaffe laughing at a flying barrel, dismissing it as too heavy, too slow, too ungainly to matter. It ended with that same barrel turning the sky into a trap no German pilot could escape. Formations that once flew with impunity found themselves hunted. Aces who had seemed untouchable fell in flames. The dominance that Germany had enjoyed since 1939 crumbled under the relentless pressure of American industry, American tactics, and American resolve, embodied in the ungainly shape of the P-47 Thunderbolt. In the decades after the war, the legacy of the Thunderbolt continued. The aircraft inspired the design of the Fairchild Republic Aten Thunderbolt II, known affectionately as the Warthog, a ground attack aircraft that inherited the Jug's philosophy of ruggedness and overwhelming firepower. The Aten, like its namesake, was not beautiful, but it was effective, reliable, and beloved by the troops it protected. The lessons of the P-47, that survival matters more than elegance, that firepower and toughness can overcome speed and grace, lived on, and somewhere in the quiet after victory, those who survived understood a truth older than any machine, older than any war. Underestimating an opponent is the first step toward defeat. Believing in your own superiority, mocking what you don't understand, dismissing what looks different, these are the errors that lose wars. The Germans had made that mistake. They had looked at the P-47 and seen a joke. They had laughed at its weight, mocked its climb rate, dismissed its awkward lines, and by the time they realized their error, by the time they understood that the Jug's 850 caliber machine guns could obliterate their formations, that its armor could keep pilots alive, that its dive speed was unmatched, it was too late. The sky had changed hands. The hunters had become the hunted, and the flying barrel they had scorned became the instrument of their destruction. The Thunderbolt's story is not one of elegance or innovation. It's a story of adaptation, of taking what you have and making it work. It's a story of young men learning to trust a machine that didn't look like much, and that machine repaying that trust by bringing them home. It's a story of the underdog, the underestimated, the unfashionable, rising to meet a challenge and exceeding every expectation. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt did more than just win battles. It changed the course of the war. It broke the Luftwaffe's back. It gave hope to those who had none. And it proved that sometimes, the thing everyone laughs at, the thing that looks wrong, the thing that doesn't fit the mold, is exactly what's needed. Wars are not won by beauty. They are won by courage, determination, and the will to keep fighting when everything says you should quit. The Thunderbolt embodied that spirit, and for the men who flew it, for the bomber crews who watched it dive to their rescue, for the ground troops who saw it tear apart enemy positions, it will always be more than just an aircraft. It was salvation wrapped in aluminum and steel, powered by an engine that refused to die, armed with guns that spoke with finality. It was the Jug, and it brought them home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.